That is the voice of Anna, the protagonist of Stay With Me Alien Abduction story. But if you listen closely, it's also the voice of anyone who has ever searched for something they can't see. An answer, a reason, a version of themselves they thought they had lost. Welcome to Horror as a Social Tool, designing interactive trauma through the lens of social work. Hello everyone, I'm Nahir Fajardo. I am the CEO and producer of Dreams of Heaven Games. Outside the studio, I work independently as a social worker focused on neurodivergence, and I'm letting you know right now that today those two identities are going to speak at the same time.
I am Michael Mora. I co-founder of Dreams Games and the lead programmer for Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story. But before you conjure an image, someone locked away staring at line of code, let me tell you something. My obsession with this project didn't start in the game engine. It started with a question that feel more interesting to my than conventional horror. And that question was why those fear in the video games almost always dependent on making you jump out of your seat. And the other questions, why those them industry assume that horror requires direct aggression. To me, the jump scares is a confession of defeat. It's telling the player we don't trust our atmosphere to be enough. I wanted the opposite. I wanted the player to be scared before they saw the alien. I wanted the forest to be enough, for the sound to be enough, for the uncertainty to be enough. What I didn't know was that on the path I would meet Nahir, and she would give a name to what I was trying to do.
When Mike showed me the first build of Stay With Me Alien Abduction story, I had already spent years working with people living with anxiety, PTSD, and various forms of neurodivergence. And what caught my attention immediately wasn't the aesthetic, though it is beautiful, it was the game didn't do. I didn't scream at you, it didn't throw things in your face. It put you in a forest, in the dark, looking for a daughter who isn't appearing. And that for me was psychologically much more honest than a jump scare. As a social worker, I have a lens I can't turn off. I can't look at the game mechanics without asking what emotional state it is modeling, whether it intends to or not. And what I began to see in Stay With Me Alien Abduction story wasn't just a horror game. It was a map of how the human mind processes loss, uncertainty, and the fear of the unknown. For a person living with anxiety, the real world is already a space of constant threat. They don't need a video game to assault them. What horror can offer them, if well designed, is sometimes much more valuable. A space where that fear has boundaries, where you can pause, where the terror has an origin and an exit screen. That is radically different from what they live day to day. And that is where horror becomes, for the first time, a social tool.
For those who don't know the game, Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story is a first-person psychological or narrative adventure. We follow Anna, a mother go to the forest where her daughter Emily disappeared. The game features a retro VHS tape, as if you are finding a tape someone forgot to record over. That texture isn't decorative; it's part of how we tell the story. The narrative is branching, decisions matter, and the environment can change with every loop, and there's something important to understand. Um, we didn't design the forest to be hallways of monsters. We designed it to be a space where paranoia builds itself, where the player starts hearing things that perhaps aren't there.
What Diego Mate, in his analysis of the evolution of horror in games, calls the third stage of horror, a terror that no longer tries to imitate the photorealism of modern cinema, but instead retreats into aesthetics of the past to create an atmosphere where what isn't seen is more powerful than what is. Stay with me, Alien Abduction Story operates exactly in this that register.
It's the abstract of this talk. We said we were going to talk about spreadsheets and decision trees. I'll be completely honest. There are no formal decision trees on whiteboards. There is a system of flags, for example, true or false variables, that records what the player experienced before requiring and activates or disactivates environment element accordingly. Is simpler than a traditional tree, and paradoxically it produces something more organic. We design it by feeling. We make decisions based on what feels emotionally right for Anna story. It was only after months of work when we stopped to look at what we had built that Nahir said something to me that made me reread all the code from a different perspective.
I told him what to build is a system for representing psychological states without having planned to do so. That is what we want to show you today. Not a method we applied from day one, but a process of retroactive recognition. We stopped to look at what we had done and understood why it worked. And that understanding changed how we continue to build. To understand the psychological foundation of Stay With Me, Alien Abduction Story, I need to cite Marco Antonio Cruz Martinez in his article regarding reflections on the uncanny and terror in human subjective. He proposed something fundamental. Psychological terror doesn't emanate from a concrete or objective truth, but from enigmatic situations that awake uncertainty and vulnerability. He uses the Blair Witch Project as an example. We don't see the witch. We don't need to. The forest, the darkness, the shaking camera, the crying voice. That is enough. The most effective treat is the one to the brain constructs in the empty space we leave for it. Our North Star as designers is not the alien figure, it is the desperation of a mother searching for her daughter in the forest that doesn't want to give her up. That is universally terrifying, and it requires no monster on screen to work.
technically that translates into a very concrete design decision. The horror in Stay With Me isn't in the triggers, is in what lies between the triggers, the analog noise, the VHS distortions, the ambient sound that the player begins to interpret as threats even if they aren't. We want the paranoia to be real. We want the players to feel that something is wrong before something is actually wrong. I'll briefly explain why ESAs isn't just a aesthetic in Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story. The VSA's shader we use is organic. It doesn't just distort the image. The chromatic aberration and tracking lines move with a rhythmic cadence. And there's more. The glitch reacts to what happened the protagonist. If the narrative tension rises, the effect becomes more aggressive. The image begins to disaggregate in the moment where Anna is losing control the most. This has a direct consequence for the players. They don't know if what they are seeing is a recording effect or a signal that something is about to happen. That ambiguity is intentional. It's the same principle that made the sound in the Silent Hill works. You don't know if the radio is detecting an enemy or the if is it already too late. Even the hub has this double role. The recording clock you see on the screen has its own script that vary its values along with the VHS shader. It's not just a time indicator, it's part of the texture of the experience. If the game disintegrates, the clock disintegrates too.
From a social work perspective, this connects to what Cruz Martinez describes as the uncanny, the discomfort generated by something that should be familiar but isn't quiet. A recording should be a record of reality, but when the recording itself starts to fail, we can no longer trust what we see. It triggers something deep in the human nervous system. There is a mechanic in the game that stopped me in my tracks the first time I played it. In moments of highest tension, Anna loses focus, the camera gradually blurs, and the control starts to respond with a delay. Mike explained to me that it was a technical decision to communicate that Anna was at her limit. I told him what you just described is called dissociation. In social work, dissociation is a defense mechanism. The mind partially disconnects from reality to protect itself from stimulus it cannot process. It isn't weakness. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it knows how to do when it is overwhelmed. What we achieved without looking for it was that the player experiences that disconnection from the inside. They get frustrated because the game doesn't respond as expected, and the specific frustration is functionally what the person in that state lives through. It isn't an explanation, it is direct experience.
And the same thing happened with sound. We use layer ambience noise to hide things. Amid so much distortion, the player begins to hear what I call auditory pareidolia, detecting patterns of threats in noise where there might be none. This generates and activate paranoia and hypervigilance that keep the player's nervous system on high alert without we need for a jump scare. The rewind system in the Stay With Me doesn't reload full essence. We work with a system of flag, true or false variables that records what decision the player made, what they saw, what point they reached. When rewinding, the game console those flags and activates or disactivates environment elements. It's lighter, faster, and produces something interesting. The environment change not purely randomly, but in a way that the player feels there are real variants to discover. The goal is for the player not to think, I have to do this again, but rather um, what is going to happen differently this time. We design for curiosity, not for fear failure.
When I understood how the rewind worked, the first thing I thought was this is rumination, that mental process where you go back over and over to the moment of a decision. Why did I take that path? What would have happened if? What's interesting is that the game doesn't propose rewind as power. Proposes it as a possibility. In the difference between a player who uses it with curiosity and one who uses it compulsively searching for a perfect ending that doesn't exist. That difference says something about how each person relates to control and error without the game having planned it in that way. Before getting into the data, I need to be very precise about what this study is and where it comes from, because it isn't market study. I didn't do it as the CEO of Dreams of Heaven Games. I did it as a social worker. My independent work is focused on neurodivergence, and one of the questions that had been haunting me for a while was about the game habits of this population, where they played, what they looked for, how they lived that experience sensorily. So I launched an exploratory survey to the gamer community in Chile. 68 responses. A small exploratory saying that doesn't allow us to make universal claims, but it did open a conversation I didn't expect. And at some point, reading the results, I realized that what I was finding in my work as a social worker had a direct conversation with what we were building at the studio. They weren't two separate worlds, they were talking to each other.
And the conversation changed some of our design decision, not because the data told us what to do, but because it asked us a question we hadn't asked ourselves.
The first number that stopped me, 83.8% of participants identified as neurodivergent. People with autism, ADHD, generalized anxiety, PTSD. There is an important methodological explanation for this. When a social worker focused on neurodivergence launched a survey about video games, neurodivergent people are going to find it and answer it. It's no surprise they are the majority. The study doesn't say most gamers are neurodivergent. It says this community is present, active, and has things to say about how they live the experience of playing. And what they had to say was significant enough to change the conversation inside the studio.
If your story talks about loss, fear, and hopelessness, and a whole community feels this way every day, it makes sense to ask, does the design include them? We never asked that question before after the study we do.
The second group of data is the most concrete of in sensorial terms. 88% of participants reported hyperacusis, extreme sensitive to sound, and 31% reported photophobia, extreme sensitive to light. From a social worker perspective, these aren't clinical curiosities. They are real barriers to participation. A person with hyperacusis in an environment with jarring noises isn't just uncomfortable, they are in pain. A person with photophobia facing intense flashes of light isn't being sensitive. Their nervous system is responding to a stimulus that is physically aggressive to them. And when I look at of those numbers and look at a conventional horror design, the conversation with Mike was inevitable.
Traditional horror games use jump scare, sudden lights, or total darkness, but this study shows that those things can be a barrier for many players. For us, the question was simple. Do we want the tension in Stay With Me, Alien Abduction story to come from hurting the senses or from the atmosphere? The answer was always the atmosphere. This data proved that our choice is always better for a lot of people. That is why we are adding accessibility options like color filters, night vision, and audio adjustment. This is not just an extra feature, it's part of the game we always wanted to make.
This was the data that moved me most as a social worker. 63.8% of participants reported that they use video games in general to regulate their emotions. Not a specific genre, not horror in particular, video games as a tool for emotional regulation. I'll explain what it means from my files. Emotional regulation is the ability to manage and respond to an emotional experience in an adaptive way. And for many neurodivergent people whose nervous system processes stimuli differently, finding regulation tools that work is not trivial. The fact that video games are one of them is significant. Now, what does that have to do with horror? I make the connection as a developer, not the study. If a significant part of this community uses video game to regulate their emotions, and we are designing a horror experience that works with complex emotional states, loss, desperation, uncertainty, then the question I ask myself is, can Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story be a space where that regulation is possible? Or are we designing it in a way that assaults it?
From a design standpoint, that question has a very concrete technical answer. The difference between horror that exhaust and or that sustain is whether the player feels they have agency, that they can breathe, that the fear has boundaries. That is what we seek with the pause, the filters, with an atmosphere that tends without collapsing, not because the study ordered us to, but because it made narrative sense, and now it also makes sense for those who will be on the other side of the screen. The last piece of data from the study is very important. 81 of players asked for detailed sound controls, not just a general volume slider. They want to control different sounds separately. This created a real question for us. Can you have a scary atmosphere and accessibility at the same time? Or does someone ruin the order? We believe they work perfectly together. When a player is not in physical pain, they can connect better with the story. Fear works better when your body is nothing the game design. The sound in Stay With Me is like a monster. It has layers of noise and audio tricks to keep you nervous. If player can adjust the sound without losing the fear, the sound doesn't become soft, it becomes accessible, and those are two very different things.
Accessible design doesn't seek to eliminate discomfort. It seeks to ensure that discomfort is narrative, not physical. That this distinction is what mattered to us as studio. And it was the study done from my other role that helped us see it more clearly.
Before we get into a specific mechanic, I want you to see the game not in description, in motion. While you watch, I suggest you pay attention to one thing, where the treat is, whether it's in what appears on the screen or in what doesn't appear, whether the fear comes from what you see or from what the sound make you imagine might be there.
What Marco Antonio Cruz Martinez describes as the core of psychological terror, uncertainty as a mechanism, the threat that doesn't fully materialize, but whose possibility is enough to trigger the fear response. That did Stay With Me alien abduction story.
To the start move, I want to draw this in my notebook. I don't see anyone.
what you saw has very specific decision behind it. Let's talk about them. When we say the data from Nahir's study, we started looking at our game in a new way. The study didn't tell us what to do. I asked us questions, and the first question was about sound. The sound in Stay With Me has many layers: the forest noise, the tape static, and sound that might not be real. These layers create the paranoia. We want players to change the volume of this layer without losing the fear. It is about fixing the balance so the player can enjoy the story instead of feeling overwhelmed. We are also adding visual modes that change how the game looks: black and white, night vision, and 4:3 screen style that make it a look like old tape. These options help players see better, but they also make the game's atmosphere much more interesting.
The immediate pause is another decision we made explicitly. In some oral design circle, there is the idea that pausing breaks immersion. That tension depends on you not being able to escape. We reject that logic. The pause doesn't break the horror, it gives the player the necessary control to be able to return. A player who can breathe and choose to continue is more emotionally present than one who is trapped. And emotional presence is what makes horror fun. I want to talk about something in the design of Stay With Me Alien Abduction story that wasn't planned as a psychological reference but completely is. The protagonist does not confront the beings. She hides, she avoids, she looks for side exits. From a social work perspective, avoidance is one of the most natural responses to trauma. When we face something that exceeds our ability to process, the nervous system chooses to save path. Don't look, don't confront, survive. What this generates in the player is hypervigilance, the of constant alert that characterizes PTSD. Any sound can be a signal. Any moment in the background of the screen can be the moment where everything breaks. Not because the game tells you so, but because the avoidance mechanic trains you for it.
And technically, that's what the glitches in the game do. They aren't always predictable. There are triggers at key narrative points where the effect happens no matter what because the story needed. But there is also a component of controller random sidedness. The same effect doesn't always happen in the same place. That is intentional. We want the paranoia to be real. We want the player to not feel that the game breaks in the same spot, because if they predict it, they are afraid, it means they are playing attention.
Diomate, in his analysis of the relationship between video games and cinematic terror, proposed a periodization that I found very useful for placing Stay With Me Alien Abduction story on the genre map. The first stage is when video games try to imitate the cinema jumpscare. The second is classic survival horror, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, where the genre replicate films' language's resources, depth, multiplicity of planes, dating. The third, which Mate places approximately from 2010 onwards, is when indie games stop looking at cinema as the horizon and start looking at their own media paths. Pixels, VHAs, modes of representation that three-dimensional realism had left behind. In this third stage, what Mattel calls the fantastic register also emerges, following Todorov, games that work with uncertainty, that never fully resolve whether what we see is real or the broken perception of character at their limit. That is exactly the theory we inhabit with Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story. Is it the recording failing, or is it Hannah?
The beauty of that register is that it doesn't require a AAA budget to work. It requires honest about what the medium can do. A tape that disintegrates can be more disturbing than a photorealistic monsters if you know how to use it.
Nowadays, when we evaluate a new mechanic for Stay With Me Alien Abduction Story, we ask ourselves a question we call the social worker lens. Does this mechanic tell the player anything about how the mind works under pressure? Does it allow them to experience something that would otherwise be invisible? Or is it simply assaulting them without narrative purpose? If the answer is the third, it's reconsidered. Not because we want to make a toothless game, but because fear without a purpose builds nothing. It's noise, and we are interested in the silence that comes after the noise, in the space where the player encounters something about themselves.
Doesn't a creative limitation is a quality filter if a mechanic passes that criterion? We know is a legitimate place in the game. If it doesn't, we have to ask ourselves why we are putting it in.
There is something I need to tell you before we finish. Something I understood relatively recently. For a long time, I described this project as a tool to help others understand trauma and neurodivergence. A game that talks about loss of control, about the mind disconnecting, about going back over and over to the same moment looking for a different decision. But one night, looking at Anna in the forest, I saw something I hadn't wanted to see. That the character I was playing wasn't just a fictional protagonist. She was, in parts, that I recognized all too well myself. The rewind mechanics and the need to find the perfect path, the dissociation you feel when you lose focus and the environment doesn't respond as you expect, the forest that never ends, all of that had an origin I knew from the inside, not just from my studies. Stay With Me, Alien Abduction Story wasn't just a social tool for the audience, it was a mirror for its creators. And what I found myself looking at wasn't always easy to see, but it was honest. And honesty, in this case, became the best argument we have for being here today.
When Nahir told me that it took me a few days to progress it because I started looking at the code differently, the flag system that record player decision, the logic that activate or deactivate element depending on what happened before, the glitch that gets more aggressive when tension rises, that isn't just software architecture, is the way I understand control, the way I relate to error, the way I sometimes prefer the environment to be predictable even at the cost of surprise. So mm, when I say our methodology is symptom translation, what I really means is that we put our own um, way of processing the words inside the game, and we hope that someone else, upon playing it, feels a little less alone with theirs.
If you take away one thing from this talk, let it be this. You don't need to have everything planned from day one for you know. You don't need to have everything planned from day one for your work to be legitimate. You don't need your methodology to be perfectly academic. You don't need to separate your personal story from the design you are making. Sometimes the most honest narrative is born exactly from where it hurts most. And that honesty is what the audience feels, even if they don't know how to name it. If horror is the oldest emotion of humanity, it's because it has always talked about the same thing, about what we don't control, about what we lose, about what we cannot see but feel is there. Designed accessible horror, horror that take uh, care of the person being scared, isn't a creative limitation. It is the greatest act of empathy we can have as developers. Let's make fear a place where everyone can enter and from which we can all emerge a little bit either. Thank you very much.